Revival by Stephen King. So this book came out, I believe, in like 2014. So it's a pretty modern era King book. And, modern Stephen King, I just don't really keep up with that much. I think his best work is pretty much behind him. Like the 80s, that was peak King. Like Carrie and Salem's Lot, the first couple of books were kind of like the beta runs. You could tell he wasn't really that sure footed as he would later become in those books. But then I think he really hit his stride with The Shining, and then going into the 80s is when he did some of his best work, like Christine, Pet Cemetery, Misery. He was putting out some real bangers in the 80s. And in the 90s, it started to fall off. You started getting stuff like Insomnia, Rose Madder, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. And then post accident modern era Stephen King is pretty hit or miss, I feel. Like Under the Dome is pretty good. 11/22/63 is actually a pretty great book, but then you also get stuff like Dreamcatcher and some pretty mid attempts at crime fiction, which I'm not really a huge fan of. But despite this book hailing from the modern era of Stephen King's career, it actually harkens back to a much earlier time because I believe that Stephen King said in an interview that he had actually had the idea for this book since like childhood. So it's kind of a throwback actually to, I guess, like his glory days. So this book is also a book where he really wears his influences on his sleeve, and actually I think he does it quite well. This book is very Lovecraftian, and Lovecraft was a big influence on Stephen King, I think, but very little of Stephen King's horror is really what you would call of the Lovecraftian bent. He rarely goes cosmic in his scope, but he does in this book, and I think he does it pretty well. This is a book that I really liked overall, although I would be lying if I said it didn't have some issues and some pretty big issues at that, but we're going to talk about that. So, what is Revival about? Well, it is narrated in the first person and is presented as kind of the testament of one Jamie Morton. And Jamie Morton starts out as a young boy growing up in the 60s and 70s in Maine, because it's almost always in Maine. And a new minister comes to town named Charles Jacobs, and he has a very pretty wife and a young son, and they seem like the perfect family, and he is a really positive influence in Jamie's life. He's a great preacher, brings the congregation together and everything, and everybody seems to like him. But then one day, um, uh, Reverend Jacobs's wife and child are killed in a road accident, and he subsequently loses his faith and delivers one final scathing sermon in which he denounces God and religion, and then he sets off to pursue his own little interest in lightning, as alluded to by the cover, because he has a very strong interest in electricity. And so he and Jamie end up parting ways until Jamie, later on as an adult, as kind of a gun for hire rock guitarist, because Jamie eventually becomes a musician and ends up strung out on heroin as well. Jamie later eventually crosses paths with Reverend Jacobs once again at a carnival, doing some interesting stuff with electricity, and then he ends up healing him with some mysterious lightning from his heroin addiction, and then they part ways again, and then they meet up again later on in like modern day, roughly. And then Reverend Jacobs wants Jamie to aid him in some rather diabolical experiments, which may just tear open the doorway between life and the afterlife, and which involves some kind of secret electricity. So that's kind of the broad overview of the plot. This book is not overly long. It's actually a shorter Stephen King book, I think. It's only 400 and something pages. And I thought the pacing was actually pretty good, considering that the plot doesn't really develop until like the last third of the book. Up until then, it's kind of just a memoir of a character's life, going from place to place, doing things, not much forward momentum. But actually, I think the pacing was pretty good. It didn't dawdle, and it it moved in a nice clip. It didn't ever seem to overstay its welcome or drag. So I'll give it that. But let's talk about the writing now because that often is my biggest issue with Stephen King, and such was the case with Revival. So I'd make no secret that I'm not the biggest fan of Stephen King's typical writing style. I find it unbearably corny and hokey and at times downright cringeworthy because it is so overly colloquial. Like, I've heard it said that Stephen King, reading a Stephen King book, is like, sitting down on your grandpa's knee and having him just tell you a story. It's very earthy, again, very colloquial. And I don't like that. I think prose should be as formal and eloquent as it possibly can. And Stephen King, the word eloquent almost never applies to a Stephen King book, and it did not apply to this book pretty much because the writing in this I found very, very bad. But again, that's just me. I know a lot of people really respond to Stephen King's all shucks style of writing where it's just reads in a very conversational style. And since this book is written in first person, it reads very conversationally. But I don't get down with that. I like the writing to be as beautiful as it can be, and this doesn't even try. Like, there were some truly cringe inducing, eye rolling moments reading this book, and I'm just not. I can't commend the writing in this book because it's insanely corny and cringy, and I just don't like it. So the writing. Another thing about the writing though is that there's a scene in this. And I tried to find it to read it. I couldn't remember what page it was on. There's a scene in this book where Stephen King uses the word emolument. And I found that odd because in Stephen King's book on writing, he talks about why you shouldn't use, according to him, flashy language and, like $10 words. And he explicitly, in On Writing, I remember that, he explicitly says, do not use words such as emolument. But then he used the word emolument in this book. I just found that kind of odd. You're not exactly practicing what you preach, Stevie. But you know, whatever. The writing is, Some people like it. I'm not one of those people. I think it's ugly and coarse, and it's so needlessly vulgar as well. I don't like that. So the writing is bad. I think I don't like Stephen King's style of writing. Typically, some books it's better than others. This one was one of the on the lower end of things, I think. But now let's talk about the characters, because that's where Stephen King almost always succeeds, is in crafting well fleshed and human characters. And, the characters in this book are decidedly thinner than the norm, I think, with Stephen King. So, like, Jamie grows up in a pretty big family. He has like four or three brothers and one sister. He has four siblings, I think, and obviously mom and dad and everything. And there's kind of a large supporting cast in the beginning section of the book, the childhood section, and all of those characters were basically nothing more than names. Like, it took me a while to even remember which sibling was which. And then they crop up later in the book in the adult sections of the book, and it's kind of like, wait, who was that again? And it's kind of excusable because this book is in first person, so there's a restriction to the viewpoint. There's a remove, I guess, there. And that kind of excuses some of it. But by and large, the characters in this book aren't quite as memorable as some of Stephen King's best, or not quite as rounded. But the real exception is Reverend Jacobs, who is kind of the subject of the book. He actually was a really good character, if only because of how his character kind of alters over time. So when the book opens and we meet him as a fresh-faced young minister back in like the 60s and 70s, it's pretty. He's pretty nice. He's a very gentle, kind-hearted kind of guy that you really like. But then as we meet him as time goes on, and Jamie uh, runs into him again and again, each time his character kind of gets a little bit more unsavory as time goes on. And then by the end, as we're doing some like hellacious experiments involving life and death, he's not really so upstanding, and I really like that because he kind of has an arc. Because his arc is that he's trying to reconnect with his dead wife and kid using secret electricity, some kind of ungodly power to connect with the other side, and he needs Jamie to help him. And his character is definitely the standout in this book. The other characters, the secondary characters, nah. But he is a really memorable character, and he really does kind of bolster the book in that regard. And now let's talk about the actual like plot of the book. You know, I try not to spoil it so much, but this is the book, like I said, where Stephen King got really Lovecraftian. It has Lovecraft all over this thing, and I think it did it pretty well actually. So at the ending is by far the best part of this book. Like the whole last third of this book is definitely its strongest part. That's when the plot really picks up, things really start happening. And I do want to say this: uh, Stephen King is not, even though he is, regarded as the master of horror. Very rarely, if ever, do I find his books to be genuinely frightening or unsettling. But this one kind of was. So again, I don't want to spoil anything, but what happens at the end, this is definitely like the most pessimistic and bleak book that I think Stephen King um, has written, and it's very saturated with religion. And I was wondering how it was going to go in that regard because we all know Stephen King does not like religion. The religious characters are almost always the villains in his book. He does not have a very high view of religion. Although I think he is personally like kind of a spiritual person. I think he does have some beliefs, but he's not a big fan of church and organized religion. And so, those characters are usually the bad guys. And this book really dealt with religion very heavily. Um, and the ending is again one of the bleakest and most dour endings, I think, maybe the dourest ending that he's ever written. And it's kind of unsettling. Like this book, it's not the actual horror only kicks in at like the very tail end, so it's not really overall scary, but it leaves you on a very unsettling note. And I will give it that. It did have an effect. After you finish reading it, you're kind of just like, that's depressing. That's kind of unnerving, moreover. And I will give it that. It did have an effect, and the ending is definitely its strongest part. But also, let's talk about some of my personal gripes with this book because there's one aspect of it that I could not let slide, and that is some of the nature of some of the relationships of the characters in this book. So towards the end of the book, our main character is like in his late 50s, pushing 60. Not much not very far removed in age from where Stephen King was when he actually wrote this book. And so the main character uh, is eventually uses a young woman in her 20s, young enough to be his daughter, for some help researching some things. And of course, they just hop into bed together like that because Stephen King, if you did not know, is a very, very, very horny man. Like, this is something about Stephen King. Probably the thing that irks me the most about the man's work is that everything has to be sexual. Everything has to be sexualized. And I really just had enough of it at this point. So I just didn't find that convincing. And he pulled the same bullshit in Mr. Mercedes. You have like a 70-something-year-old cop. It's like Stephen King's age, and then like a 30 or 40-ish woman in that book who just immediately bangs the main character that she's known for like 3 days because of course women love to just throw themselves at men old enough to be their fathers. I mean, like the only women that do that are gold diggers or women who have severe unresolved daddy issues. And I just did not find that aspect of this book convincing because I knew what it was. I knew what Stephen King was doing. It's Stephen King, now an old man in his twilight years, impressing his own sexual fantasies onto his work, where he's like, I could still, if I wasn't married, I'm sure I could still land me one of those young fillies in bed. And I'm like, no, Stephen, you can't. Your average 20-something-year-old woman does not hop into bed with a nearly 60 man unless she wants money or, again, she has some serious daddy issues. And I just can't stand that about Stephen King's books, how everything has to be sexual. He is so incredibly horny, and the narration of his books constantly just they just fetishize the female figure just to the nth degree. Anytime a female character walks away, it's some remark about her ass, and then in here, one it's just thighs, breast, everything constantly, and I'm just so tired of that. Like Stephen King, we get it. You have a libido of a man much younger than you are, but enough's enough. Like, stop being so horny. And I didn't like that about this book. That's another aspect. The sexual relationship between the main character and another character was not convincing in the slightest. And that brought it down a little bit in my eyes. But overall, to rate Revival by Stephen King, I'm going to give this book a good solid B. I think this is one of Stephen King's strongest modern books, strongest books that he's put out uh, in his modern era of his career. I think this is about as good as Stephen King gets anymore. And again, that might be because this book, he had been sitting on it for a very long time, but this book mostly worked. The writing I did not like. I thought the prose is ugly and coarse, needlessly so. So much needless vulgarity in the writing, and of course the constant over sexualization of everything. I just can't stand. The characters were good enough, although again thinner than your typical Stephen King book. The main character, the narrator, is kind of just your typical Stephen King protagonist, but he's fleshed out enough. You do kind of feel like you're reading a real person. And then the Reverend Jacobs is the real draw here in terms of character. He's the real standout. But the plot really, again, it develops kind of slowly, but not too slowly. And I think it actually culminates quite well. I think the ending to this is actually quite strong. And I can't say that about a lot of Stephen King books because, again, he bungles the ending so much, so often. But not so with this one. The denouement of this book I found quite thrilling, and the note that it ended on was quite disquieting, I found. And so this book really did have an effect to it. So I'm gonna give this book, yeah, a good solid B. I think this is certainly one of Stephen King's best modern books, and it's also something of a rarity in that it's a Stephen King book that has not thus far been turned into film. Although I have no doubt that it eventually will be, because if you didn't notice, since about the year 2017, we have been living in the renaissance of Stephen King film adaptations. I mean, they have been adapting and readapting so much of that man's work. And this book's kind of odd because it hasn't so far gotten a film adaptation, but like I say, give it time, I'm sure it will. But yeah, so to rate Revival overall, good solid B. I think it is really probably about as good as Stephen King gets anymore. So, Revival by Stephen King. Have you read Revival? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything that I've said about it here today. And if you have not read Revival, I could really recommend this. It does have issues, but I think overall it's a success, and a pretty solid success at that. So I could definitely recommend this. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.